Professor Stephen Litch in the Principles of Economics, and I'll be discussing factors that change demand or supply. And by that I mean factors that change the entire demand curve and the entire supply curve. Okay, so let me start by reminding you all of what the demand curve reports. And for now, look at this blue demand curve. Okay, every demand curve tells the quantity that a consumer would purchase at each price. So on this blue demand curve, the consumer at a price of $7, the consumer would purchase one widget or whatever it is. At a price of $1, the person would purchase four. So again, each demand curve reports the quantity that a person would purchase at all the different prices. Now, we often add on to that, holding everything else the same. So again, that demand curve is just about changing price. So any other change is going to alter the entire demand curve. Okay, we talk about things as increasing demand or decreasing demand. When we say that something increases demand, it means that at every price the consumer would purchase more of the good. Okay, something that reduces demand is something that would reduce the quantity a person purchases at every price. Okay, so an increase in demand will look like a shift to the right in the demand curve. So here I have a blue demand curve, and then the brown demand curve represents an increase in demand. Okay, the curve has moved to the right. And that really means that at every price, the consumer would purchase more. So, for example, at a price of $3, initially on the blue demand curve, the consumer would have purchased three of this good. When demand increased, the person will purchase six. Okay? And at a different price, like at $5, initially, the consumer would have purchased two. After the consumer's demand increased, the consumer will purchase four. Okay? So again, something that increases demand will raise the quantity demanded at each price. And it will look like the entire demand curve has shifted to the right. Now, another interpretation of changing demand is that the consumer would purchase the same quantity at a higher price. So here I've drawn the same two demand curves, blue for before any change, the brown demand curve after demand increases. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that for a quantity of 3, okay, initially the consumer would have been willing to purchase 3 at a price of $3. After the consumer's demand increased, the consumer would purchase 3 at a price of $6. So we could also think of an increase in demand as something that would raise the price that a consumer would pay for some quantity of the good. Okay. Now, there are several things that will increase demand or decrease demand. All of the things on this list right now will shift the entire demand curve. Okay. First, income. Okay. So the way that income impacts demand depends on what type of good it is. For most goods, more income will increase demand. If you have more income, you could afford to purchase more of a good, and in most cases, that's what you want to do. The exceptions are called inferior goods, and an inferior good is something that you purchase more of when your income goes down, and you purchase less of an inferior good when your income rises. That is the definition of an inferior good. The best example would probably be like ramen noodles. Ramen noodles We eat because they are a cheap way of getting food into our bodies, but not something that we really desire. And if we had more money, then our demand for ramen noodles would decrease. So that's an example of an inferior good. Another example of an inferior good might be a used car. As our incomes go up, our demand for used cars goes down because we can afford to buy a nice new uh, car instead. So usually inferior goods are lower quality alternatives to a different good. So like ramen noodles are a lower quality alternative to real food. A used car is a lower quality alternative to a new car. We could probably come up with examples of clothing that are inferior goods. Probably wearing t-shirts is, or well, probably t-shirts are an inferior good. That is, we have more income, we prefer to purchase more nice clothes and fewer t-shirts. Okay, so again, an inferior good, demand falls as income rises. Everything else is a normal good, and normal is the technical term in that case. All right, second thing that will affect the entire demand curve are the prices of related goods. And we talk about two different types of related goods: substitutes and complements. Okay, so um, I'll start by telling a little story that you have decided this evening you're going to go buy some pizza, and as you're walking down the street to your favorite pizza parlor, you see a sign in the window of the hamburger joint saying, "Tonight's special, all hamburgers 50% off." And you think to yourself, oh, you know what? Since hamburgers are on sale, forget about buying the pizza. I'll get a hamburger for dinner tonight. Okay, so there, the price of hamburgers has affected your demand for pizza because they are related goods. They're both foods. And and I would say they are substitutes in like the unofficial way we use the word, the common use of the word. One can substitute for the other at dinner. Um, so, uh, so these two goods, pizza, hamburgers, might be substitutes, and a decrease in the price of the substitute good will reduce demand for this good. So, like a decrease in the price of hamburgers reduces demand for pizza. Um, the opposite type of related good is a complement. Complements are two goods that go especially well together. See, substitutes are like you want one, but not, or you want one or the other, but not both. Whereas complements are more along the lines of you want both or neither. They tend to go together well. Um, so, classic example of complementary goods would be peanut butter and jelly. If you're going to have a sandwich, you would prefer for it to have both peanut butter and jelly to having one but not the other. Um, again, the combined effect of the two goods is more than each good on its own. Those are complements. I might also bring up gasoline as an example of a good that is related to other goods. And gasoline is a complement to gas-powered cars. Um, Gasoline on its own is not very useful. Uh, a gas-powered car on its own is not very useful. But if you consume the two of them together, a gas-powered car plus gasoline, that is something that's super useful. So you kind of need to have both of them together instead of just one. Okay. On the other hand, um, gasoline is really a substitute for electric-powered cars. You don't need both. You need one or the other. If you have an electric car, you have no need for gasoline. If you have gasoline, you need a gas-powered car, but you don't need an electric car. So again, gasoline you can think of as a good that's related to the two different types of cars. Gasoline is a complement to gas-powered cars, and gasoline is a substitute for electric cars. Okay, with complements, an increase in the price of the complement reduces demand for this good. So like an increase in the price of gasoline reduces demand for gas-powered cars. Or or to flip that around, reducing the price of the complement increases your demand for this good. So if you go to the grocery store and jelly is on sale, naturally you purchase a lot of jelly. But then, because you have jelly, you need more peanut butter to go along with it. So you purchase more jars of peanut butter than you normally would have because jelly is on sale this week. The price of jelly affects your demand for peanut butter. Okay, so I've talked about income is something that affects demand, prices of related goods. Next, preferences. These are simply a matter of what people like, and they can differ, they can change over time. One example might be simply smoking, and smoking involves a trade-off for people, trading off some enjoyment from nicotine today versus health consequences in the future. And the way that a person weighs those two things, like enjoyment today versus bad health in the future, that's simply a matter of preferences. How forward-looking a person is, or how much they like to live in the present, that's simply a matter of preference. And economists can make predictions that if preferences change in one way or another, demand will change in one way or the other. But we can't really comment on what are the right preferences to have. Okay, next on the list, expectations. So things like expectations of future prices could be important, or expectations of needs in the future. Even before the COVID pandemic affected the United States, we might have realized that in the future we would need certain supplies like hand sanitizer, face masks, toilet paper, and in anticipation of the pandemic affecting the U.S., we might have increased our demand for those goods. So, why were we purchasing more hand sanitizer in February? Our income had not changed. Prices of related goods had not changed. Our preferences had not changed. It was simply expectations about the future. We anticipated that hand sanitizer would become more useful in the future. Okay. Next, the number of buyers in the market will affect demand. Everything else the same. As there are more buyers in the market, people will want to purchase more together. Okay, so this is simply saying that 5 people will purchase more than 3 people would have purchased. Okay, moving on to the next topic. Sorry. I'm going to do an example right now of what happens to a market when there is a change in demand. So here, the market for face masks in November 2019, before the COVID pandemic. There was some demand for the face masks. That's the red demand curve. There's some supply, and the market was in equilibrium at a price of P star, where Q star masks were purchased. Then the pandemic came along, and it changed demand for the face masks. It changed people's preferences for having clean air. So here's the market for face masks in July 2020. Demand had increased, and that's represented by shifting the entire demand curve to the right. Okay, so from the red curve marked D to the orange curve marked D prime. And the market equilibrium changes. The new equilibrium occurs where supply and demand intersect. So this is at a price of P prime, where quantity Q prime are sold. Okay? So if we want to analyze how a change in preferences affects the market, we can think of the market in equilibrium before the change and then after the change. The equilibrium always occurs where demand and supply intersect. Okay, now, next topic is factors affecting the supply curve. So when we say that something increases supply, that means that shifts the supply curve to the right. And, in other words, at each price, the suppliers would be willing to sell more. Okay, so compare the dark blue supply curve to the light blue supply curve. On the dark blue curve, the producer was willing to sell 140 widgets at a price of $12. After some increase in the supply, at the same price, $12, the producer is willing to sell 180. Okay? And at any price, the light blue curve says that a higher quantity would be supplied. Okay. So, the other way to think of an increase in supply is that the producer would be willing to sell the same quantity at a lower price. Okay? So, for a quantity of 150, initially on the dark blue supply curve, this producer would have been willing to sell 150 widgets at a price of $14. But after an increase in supply, this producer is willing to sell 150 widgets at a price of $8. Okay? So, when we talk about increasing supply, that means that something changes the supply curve to the right or down. And again, there are these two different interpretations. One is that the producer would be willing to sell a greater quantity at the same price, which is the same as saying that the producer would be willing to sell the same quantity but at a lower price. Okay. The factors that will shift the supply curve include the cost of inputs. So if inputs into production become cheaper, supply will increase. Supply curve will shift right. Second, technology. As technology improves, the supply can only increase. The supply curve will shift to the right. A third thing, expectations. Just as consumers look to prices in the future, a producer might think about prices in the future when trying to decide what to sell today. If the producer anticipates that prices will go up, it might reduce the amount that the producer will sell today. And then the final thing is the number of sellers. With more sellers in the market, more output will be sold at the same price. Okay. Here's an example of an analysis of how a change in supply affects the market. During the COVID pandemic, there was a shortage of processed meats that happened sometime early in the summer of 2020. Okay, and we can maybe think of this as an increase in the cost of safely producing meat in meat processing plants. So let's go back to February 2020, before the COVID lockdowns, um, before any real changes in the US economy. There was a market for bacon, and the market was in equilibrium at a price of P star, where Q star bacon was sold. Then the pandemic raised the costs of producing bacon. That reduces supply, so it shifts the supply curve to the left, okay, and the market will find a new equilibrium. So supply curve shifted to the left to what I'm calling S prime, and the new equilibrium occurs where supply intersects demand. But now that's this point at a price of P prime, where the quantity sold is Q prime. Okay, so this is a basic analysis of how changing supply will impact the market. Reduction in supply is represented as shifting the supply curve to the left and up. It means that the new equilibrium price will increase while the quantity sold in the market will go down. Okay. An increase in supply works just the opposite way. An increase in supply is a shift to the right in the supply curve, and then the market equilibrium price will fall while the quantity sold will increase. Okay, so with that, I am done describing shifts in the demand and supply curves.